Welcome everyone to this episode of the Tiny Fit Diva podcast. I'm your host, Kylene Terhune, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. I work with clients all across the country through functional lab testings to help them uncover the reasons that they are struggling with chronic disease, and then we come up with natural and holistic lifestyle and supplemental approaches to help them heal. And today I have a really interesting interview for you today. I'm going to introduce you to Mark Gober. Is that how you pronounce your last name? Okay, perfect. And we were just talking before we started about how his book is about consciousness, and he's sort of turning it upside down and how we view that in the scientific world. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But before we do, let me give him an introduction. Mark is an author whose worldview was turned upside down in 2016 when he was exposed to world-changing science. This science suggests that that contrary to mainstream assumptions, consciousness is not produced by the brain. After researching extensively, he wrote the book An End to Upside Down Thinking to introduce the general public to these cutting-edge ideas, all in an effort to encourage a much-needed global shift in scientific and existential thinking. Now, what's interesting about this is you are totally not this existential woo-woo thinker, right? So share kind of what's your history? How did you even get into this way of thinking?
So my background professionally is I'm a partner at a technology advisory firm in Silicon Valley called Sherpa Technology Group. So we advise companies on mergers and acquisitions and strategy. Prior to that, I was an investment banking analyst with UBS in New York during the financial crisis. And prior to that, I was at Princeton University where I was captain of the tennis team. So people, when they hear that background, it's like, what's the connection to consciousness? And on the surface, there really isn't any. But I guess my interests in big questions have always been there. And even in college, I almost majored in astrophysics because I wanted to understand, like how things work and what we're doing in the universe. Yeah. But my commitments on the tennis team made it too much. So the interests have been there, but it wasn't until about 2 years ago when I first was listening to podcasts, and it was actually Extreme Health Radio. We were just talking about it. I was listening to health podcasts, and one of the interviews that came on was a woman who described her psychic abilities and the ability to communicate with dead people and work with energy, and how she was using that with clients to shift their lives. And then at the end of that, the woman, Laura Powers, mentioned her own podcast, Healing Powers, in which she discusses these same things with other people who've had similar experiences. So I ended up listening to her podcast in the car, driving to and from work for a few weeks, just leaving it on. And at a certain point, I was like, wait a second, how are so many people describing these experiences that I've never heard about before? And they're all talking about a picture of reality that doesn't align with anything I've learned. Because my worldview was very much a conventional worldview, and we can talk about what that means in terms of implications. But the mainstream scientific view does not lead to a belief in meaning, because it kind of implies that the body is all there is, that the body randomly emerged from physical matter, and once the body dies, your consciousness is gone. And that's basically what I thought science said. So that's what I thought was real. And what I was learning in these podcasts was that something different was going on. So that led me to research and look at the actual science. And then I realized there was a whole body of science behind this. I ended up researching extensively for a year because I had to rethink my whole life to understand what this universe is and who am I and is there meaning, is there not meaning? And that shifted things for me once I saw that full body of evidence. So I never actually had a plan to write a book as I was researching. It was all just personal interest and passion to understand this stuff. And throughout that process, I started to tell friends about the information I was learning. At first, I didn't talk to anybody about it because it sounded so crazy. And then as I felt more comfortable talking about it, I told people, and the reactions were very positive. And people said that the information was like kind of shifting their outlook on life in a really positive way. So I said, okay, I'm combining the reactions I'm getting based on sometimes short conversations with people with the fact that I'm passionate about this. Why don't I try writing? So I literally wrote the whole book over a few weekends in July. It just happened really quickly. Until I was finished I couldn't relax. It was a weird thing, or I just wanted to get it out as quickly as I could. And that's the book that's out. Very short story.
Wow. So let's talk about what the foundation is, because what's so interesting to me is you talk about what a huge shift that was from where you came from to where you are now mentally and in terms of your worldview and your perspective. And what's so interesting, I guess, to me is when I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, like that just makes sense. So I come from a history of faith. I'm a Christian, and so my worldview comes from the biblical worldview. And so when you're talking about consciousness and it being there after our physical bodies die, I'm like, well, duh, right? Like we're these like eternal beings, right? But you're talking about, a lot of people view consciousness as being actually part of the physical brain. And so that's sort of the history that you had grown up with, that it kind of came out of your physical brain and that your brain produced what we think of as consciousness. And really quickly, I'm just going to read this quote because I think it's a really great way that you describe consciousness so we can kind of all get on the same page. You say your consciousness is experiencing the reading of these words right now. Consciousness is your sense of being you, and it is your sense of experiencing life. When you say, I am reading this book, you could regard I as consciousness, right? So
Yes.
in the spiritual world, we might almost think of it as our soul, or have you sort of seen a separation between those two, or...
It's so funny you asked that. In an interview I had yesterday, this was one of the first questions I had
Oh,
also.
really?
And it hasn't come up in a lot of other ones. But I didn't use the word soul on purpose because I think so many people have different meanings for that word. And if I had read that word 2 years ago or 2+ years ago, I might have shut down.
Sure.
But I think based on how many people interpret the soul as being kind of the version of us that is not tied to the body, that survives the body and has been there before and will be there after, then yes, that's, I guess, what I'm referring to.
Okay, so let's sort of get into some definitions here. So you came from what you call materialism. Can you go into a little bit of that and what that means?
Yeah, it's a really important place to start, I think, because fortunately for you, I think you had a background where you've understood the reality that we're in. For me, I didn't have that. And our education system starts with this materialist perspective, which says that this is how life goes. There was a big bang 13.8 billion years ago. It filled the universe with matter. And by matter, I mean physical stuff, like your table. My table's made out of atoms. That's matter. You have a lot of matter in this big universe, and chance says that you will end up with matter that interacts with other matter. We call that chemistry. So we start with matter, we get chemistry. When you have enough random chemical reactions, you're bound to end up with a self-replicating molecule, DNA, that leads to biology. So matter leads to chemistry, leads to biology. And biology is like a human being. Human being evolves to have a brain. And then once the brain evolves, consciousness comes out of the brain through some kind of chemical reaction that science doesn't fully understand. So materialism, it's materialism because it starts with physical material, matter, and we end up with consciousness. Matter creates consciousness through a brain. That's what the conventional perspective is. And as I mentioned earlier, what this perspective implies, if you really think about it and take it literally, once your body and your brain die, there's nothing to produce consciousness anymore. So your consciousness is gone. It means your memories, it means everything that you experienced in your life is over. So meaning in life is almost a rationalization. Good and bad things happen to you while you're living, but why does it matter? Because you're going to be dead. That's what's implied by what is being taught in our science today. And it wasn't until I really pushed on some of those assumptions and acknowledged that that was the chain of events that science was proposing, and then looking at the assumptions and realizing, wait a second, they're really shaky assumptions, and there's evidence to suggest that these are totally wrong. So what I end up coming to, which we can discuss, I'm sure, at length, is the idea that consciousness doesn't come at the end of the picture. Rather, it comes first. So physical, material, chemistry, biology, brains even, they're all still there, but they're all within consciousness. Consciousness is like the pre-existing force, or I'm not even sure what to call it, that everything else is an experience within. Consciousness is fundamental rather than matter is fundamental.
Yeah, so again, see, just because I'm coming from my faith perspective, that totally makes sense to me, because in the way, when I was reading this is what I was thinking. To me, my understanding is that God basically is consciousness. So since we are created in his image as a piece of that, we have like this spiritual side, this conscious side, but we're placed in these physical bodies, in this physical realm. So it was interesting, as you were talking about and we'll get into this, I know, as the brain function diminishes, it's almost like you tap more into that side, and you're talking about the meaning, how this shifts like the meaning of your life and things like that. And so one of the books I'm going through right now, I don't know if you've heard it, is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And one of the things that he says in there, because he was an atheist, and so Mere Christianity is basically like his understanding of Christian theology, basically. But one of the things he said was, if there was no meaning to life, if there was no purpose to life, we would stop asking the question. Like, it wouldn't exist. Like, the question wouldn't be there. And it's interesting because through history, that is a question that drives humanity, is what is the meaning of life, right? And so it keeps coming up and it keeps coming up. And so there's got to be, right? There is this purpose, there is this meaning. And so you're relating it to this consciousness that we share in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the conventional perspective on that, because I was such a big part of the conventional perspective,
Sure.
would rebut and say, well, the consciousness we have is just a hallucination caused by chemicals, and it's part of our evolutionary process to question things. And that's just this questioning of the meaning of life is just a byproduct of that, because we are evolved. Right. So that's the back and forth that I think happens when you think about things conceptually. And that's why for me, for the book and the things that really got me interested were these phenomena that didn't make sense according to the old view. And then other things you mentioned, where we have reduced brain activity that relates to heightened conscious experience, which matches the idea that the brain is like a filtering mechanism of consciousness, or an antenna, rather than the producer.
Yeah, let's talk about that. There's some weird stuff in this book, man. There is some weird stuff. It's like I was reading some of these stories out loud last night to my husband. I was like, listen to this. We were in the near-death experience section of the book last night, and I was like, honey, you got to hear this. And we were talking about, I think one of my favorite stories was when the subject was blind, and they would have a near-death experience, and then they would essentially see during this experience. So, but let's talk, before we get into all that, let's talk about, what do you mean by diminished brain capacity, basically allowing you to experience consciousness more effectively?
And before that, I'll just establish that Science Magazine has said that the number 2 question that remains in all of science is basically, how does a brain produce consciousness? We have no idea how it could ever happen. So that's just an important point to start, where even those who are proponents of the materialist idea, they don't even know how the brain could produce consciousness. And for me, that was a shock to realize that that's such a big question still.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of theories that float around out there that people just latch onto, and because it promotes their worldview, right? So if it's different, because you were running into this a lot in the book, if it's different, they'll argue it regardless of whether it makes sense or not.
Yeah, which is almost a form of like orthodox religion, or like dogmatic religion, in a like fundamentalist perspective on something, where it's I believe this and there's no alternative to it. And that's kind of what certain people in science are doing now, which is very ironic, because the scientific organization, I think, became so strong because it was kind of trying to counterbalance those in the religious circles who were not open to other ideas.
I think they mesh. Yeah.
They mesh.
I think they mesh. In the real world. Yeah.
I think there are 2 different approaches at trying to understand reality, and there's overlap. That's kind of where I come out now, is that both point to different things. But so why do we assume that the brain produces consciousness? Why could a scientist who's very, very smart hold on to the belief that the brain produces consciousness, even though we don't know for sure that that's the case? The reason is that there's a lot of brain activity correlated with conscious experience. So if you stimulate a part of the brain, then we know that there's going to be a certain change in the person's consciousness.
Like movement, for example, even.
Yeah, movement, or let's say someone gets in a car accident and you damage part of the brain. That person might have memory loss, or they might have difficulty in other areas. So we can say over and over again, if you change the brain, you change the consciousness. So the assumption is, and I think this is the faulty assumption that the history books will look back on, is, wait, it must be the case that the brain produces consciousness because there's such a strong relationship. The problem there, or potential error, just looking at this logically, is that we know correlation does not imply causation. In other words, just because 2 things are related does not always mean that one is producing the other. So think about an analogy. If you have a fire, lots of firefighters show up. You have a larger fire, more firefighters show up. Did the firefighters cause the fire in each case?
Right.
They didn't, but there's a
No.
strong correlation. There
Sure.
are alternative possibilities. And this is getting to your question about brain function and conscious experience, which is that if we view the brain as being like a receiving mechanism for consciousness, like an antenna receiver, or the analogy that's more precise is like a filtering mechanism, where consciousness exists independently of the body, and the brain actually doesn't produce consciousness, but it's shielding much of the conscious reality that's out there. So we end up with, and I discussed this in chapter 2, many examples where there's a reduction in brain functioning associated with enriched experiences, which is sort of like this idea that by reducing the noise in the brain, we are able to then experience things that are there that we're typically just filtering out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you talk about some pretty crazy things that people can experience, and but I was thinking when I was reading that, I was thinking it's similar to the goal behind meditation. Really, is to calm your brain, get it into that really calm state, and then people experience different things when they're able to tap into that. And you also mentioned, and I kind of like keep hopping back and forth, but you also talk about, these almost like psychic abilities that people have, but it seems like people have different levels of abilities. And so I think that's the same too with meditation, even being able to physically control getting into certain states. People have different gifts in those areas.
I think it's all related. The practice of meditation is sort of like clearing your antenna. It's a very broad metaphor.
Yes.
There's all the stuff out there that you can receive, and we're just too busy thinking. When you do meditate or do similar practices, it allows you to pick up the signal.
So let's talk about those signals, okay? Because you talk about something called entanglement, and I think this is so cool because I feel like we can all relate to this in some way or another. So it's the concept that we are all connected, and that there's energy that's transferred, and that we can sense things. And you have studies in there where people can, guess who's calling them. And I mean, I feel like we've all had those experiences. Like in high school, when I was dating this guy for a really brief period of time, and I didn't know really why I needed to call him, but I decided to call him, and he was having like a really rough day. He's like, "Oh my gosh, like, how'd you know?" And it was like right at that moment. And I feel like we've all had those, I guess you could say intuition, but you would maybe describe that a little bit differently.
I think intuition is a word that describes these things very well, but the phenomenon of entanglement, this is an area of quantum physics. And I think it's really important just to mention quantum physics because it's not something we talk about in our day-to-day lives, but it is now known after 100 years of research that this is the reality that we're in. It's a quantum reality, and we don't see it with our eyes. But one of the major tenets of quantum mechanics is entanglement, which is the idea that two physical particles that are physically distant from each other. And this is a simplification. When you affect one of the particles, you affect the other one mirrors it at the same instant, which is suggesting that there's some interconnectedness that we're not seeing with our eyes. And it doesn't matter how far apart the particles are. So Albert Einstein actually hated this. He said it was spooky action at a distance, and he tried to disprove it. And he ended up actually proving that it's real when he tried to disprove it. So this is totally accepted that there are hidden connections, that the connection is exceeding the speed of light. Einstein thought the speed of light was the fastest thing that anything can travel, which is fast, but it's not instantaneous. And here we're seeing literally an instantaneous connection between two things that are not connected that we can see with our eyes. So how does this or potentially apply to consciousness? We see a number of phenomena where, like you described, where you think of somebody and then there's something relevant about that person, or they text you or they call you. There's a study in the field of telepathy, and I have a whole chapter on telepathy, meaning like telepathic mind-to-mind communications. It's called the Gansfeld experiment, and this is the one that has been done probably more than any other study in the field of telepathy. And when you combine all the results, you end up with like more than 1 billion to 1 odds that this is odds against chance, meaning that if you apply the standards of any other area of science, this is an accepted phenomenon. And the basic design is like this. You have Bob in one room, and Bob is put into a very relaxed state, listening to relaxing music, basically put into a meditative state. Jane is in another room, and the experimenters show Jane a film clip or a picture, and she's looking at it. And Bob doesn't know what she's looking at. Jane is told by the experimenters to mentally send what she's looking at to Bob using her mind. So she does that for a while. Bob then comes out of his relaxed state and is shown 4 pictures. And the experimenters ask Bob which of the 4 pictures was Jane sending to you mentally. We would expect, if there were no effect, that Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, 25%. But instead, it's closer to 32% when you combine all the results, which is suggesting that some information that's not non-chance is getting through. And it actually conforms to our everyday experience, because if we were 100% telepathic, we would know each other's thoughts all the time. But we know that's not the case. Instead,
Darn it.
It's maybe for better or for worse.
I think it's a good thing. Nobody needs that.
But sometimes it's subtle. Maybe you picked up on you needed to call this person because you could sense things. And this was like the 7% above chance that you were feeling. But this is for everyday people, these studies. These are not trained people. These are not the people that the U.S. government has used for psychic spying.
Now, did the two, we'll get to that because that's fascinating. Did we, did they know each other, the 2 people? Or
I think typically they don't. But it's a really good question, because studies have been done with emotional closeness related to telepathy. When people are more emotionally close, the effect is higher.
That's what I was assuming, because it's like you, not to get super woo and sound super weird, but you almost connect to like your husband's energy, or you really sort of, you get really close to someone. I mean, you can even think about that with past relationships. Sometimes you'll all of a sudden start thinking about someone you knew like 10 years ago. You're like, why am I thinking about this person? And you were connected to them very strongly at one point, and then you haven't had anything to do with them in several years, then all of a sudden you're thinking about them and you find out something's happened in their life, or there's some dramatic, thing going on, or they were thinking you, or they call you the next day, or, whatever it is. And so that would make sense to me in a situation like that the results would be higher if you were emotionally close to someone.
You're right. And that's what the studies are confirming. But part of the problem is that the studies are not broadcasted out to the mainstream. Like, they've been done, and only certain people are studying them because they're so controversial. And those in the scientific community who are so stuck in the belief system that they have will not even accept these studies. So I felt really compelled to put it in one place for people, so that, you've had experiences that conform to this research.
Yeah, so let's talk about, not conspiracy theories necessarily, but the fact that the government actually acknowledges that some of this is real.
I know.
Like I think that was probably the most mind-blowing part of the book. I mean, because the rest of it, I'm like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Oh yeah, that makes sense. And then I'm like, wait a second, the CIA is using psychics for and they're literally using them to help them find things and all this crazy stuff.
I know. I think it's really compelling, and it does sound kind of conspiracy theory-ish, but it's, again, just a piece of evidence. So I'm like, even though it sounds conspiracy theory-ish, I had to put it in there. Yeah. The U.S. government ran a program for more than 20 years, and who knows if more, but during the Cold War, using psychic spies to try to have an advantage in the war. And there have been
reports in your book that some of it was very effective.
Apparently it was. And the former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, confirmed that they're called remote viewers. So remote viewing is the ability to perceive something with your mind, meaning you're far away from it. You don't even know what's there, and you're able to see it with your mind without your eyes and draw it out. Remote viewers were used to find a downed Russian bomber that was lost in an African jungle that they couldn't find anywhere. And Jimmy Carter has confirmed this. So you have, Jimmy Carter confirming it publicly. All the people in the research program at Stanford University, like the remote viewers themselves, they all say that this was happening. The researchers who were laser physicists at Stanford, they all say it's real. And Russell Targ, for example, even wrote a book a few years ago talking about the proof for extrasensory perception, and talks about all this. Yeah. Then I think perhaps most compellingly, you have declassified CIA documents that I included in the book that came out, that were just declassified in the last few years. I'll read a direct quote. Remote viewing is a real phenomenon. This is like part of their internal documents. Implications are revolutionary. Evidence too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence.
But nobody knows about that.
I know.
Yeah.
I had never heard of remote viewing.
I know, it's super weird. And if you did, it's probably like, oh yeah, it's like those crazy people saying they saw UFOs or whatever, right? Like that's the group of people that it would fall into, right? So before we get into maybe some of the implications and how this changes a little bit and how maybe it affects your health and things like that, I love animals. So there were two things that stood out to me in the book. One was the totally inhumane experiment that they did on animal brains that like blew my mind. I was like, oh, how could they do this? It's so mean. But it was fascinating. The results were super fascinating. Can you share just really quickly what that was?
Yeah, so there are experiments that I don't think they've been done recently, probably because of animal rights issues. And I don't endorse what they did to the animals, but
right.
The results are interesting, where basically the researchers were mashing up animal brains, putting them back into the animals, and the animals were still able to function in certain ways.
Yeah.
And there was a book called Shuffle Brain, and the researcher, who was a materialist, was actually trying to disprove the people that were saying that this stuff is real, where you could mess up something's brain, put it back in, and it would work. So he was playing around with salamander brains, mashing them and then putting the brains back into the salamanders, and they were still exhibiting feeding behavior. So they were still having this routine that even if they were kind of stumbling around, they could do it. And in one case, he even used part of a tadpole's brain and put it in with the salamander's brain after mashing it up, and it was still able to do certain things. So he even says that he had to give up his materialistic perspective and start his intellectual life all over again.
Yeah, incredibly gross, but fascinating. And it's just really interesting that a body can function at all at any level when the brain is essentially destroyed. That's super weird.
It is.
So, but the other way more fun to talk about part about animals in the book is, their connection to their owners. And there was a story about the dog that knew when their owner was coming home that I was just like, no way, that's so cool. So you can apparently find this video online, right?
Yes, it's Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who's run about 200 trials with this particular couple of a dog and an owner. But he's done this with other types of animals and other types of owners. But this is the one that really stands out because he has videos of it and did a lot of studies. But basically, this dog seemed to go to the window when the owner was on her way home, Pam. And so he randomized everything so that you could get rid of all possible issues of, oh, the dog was just smelling it because she was close. Or the dog just knew she was coming home at a certain time because that's when she always comes home. Or she knew that the dog knew that this is the sound of the car that she drives. They randomized all of it. They sent her off in a taxi cab. She didn't even know when she was coming home. She'd come home at a random time. They have a video camera on the dog. And what would happen, and this is what the video shows, when you have video of the dog, video of Pam, the woman, she is out in a park somewhere miles away from home. The experimenter she's with gets a text saying, okay, Pam, it's time for us to find a cab.
Because she didn't know. She didn't even know when she was coming back.
She didn't know until the experimenter that she was sitting next to got a text from the other experimenter. Hey, it's time for you to come home. As she is deciding to walk to the taxi, she's on her way to the taxi, the dog gets up, goes to the window. So this is happening beyond chance when you run the statistics. It's right. It is kind of crazy, but it's suggesting that there's some telepathic communication, unless we assume that there's fraud involved. And right, so we can make that claim, and that's certainly what some people have said. However, there were skeptics that tried to duplicate the study and replicate it. They ran 4 trials rather than some 200, and they told the world that it was fraudulent and they didn't replicate the results. There is no dog telepathy. But then years later, they admitted after showing the results that they actually matched the data pattern that Dr. Sheldrake got. So it was like his reputation was already damaged, and then years later, they confirmed that it was actually real.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's, when you're really connected to your pets, you just want to believe stuff like that, because you're just like, you're so smart. And, it's interesting because it's like, if you go back to the lowered brain capacity, you're like, well, they don't have all the distractions that we have. And so maybe there's this level of awareness that, they do have that we don't, not necessarily that they're, same as humans, but you know what I'm saying? I guess that's kind of a weird way to say it, but.
Well, I think you're right.
They don't have all the input.
Right. And the brain is definitely related to our conscious experience. We know that. So they have a different kind of a brain. So their conscious experience is going to be different. And there are a number of examples that I mentioned with regard to animals where they seem to know things, like they avoid natural disasters and tsunamis. They're nowhere to be found. I mean, are they sensing vibrations, or is this part of their abilities to know things. I don't think we know, but we have to question.
You had mentioned, I think it was frogs or something. And because I was thinking that when I was reading, I was like, oh, well, they have these extreme senses. And so they would, leave ahead of time. But then the amount of time that they left, it was like 6 days or something crazy far away from the actual event.
Right.
And I was like, oh, well, okay. What vibration are they going to feel 6 days in advance?
Right. And I know the vibration theory is one that I always thought was the case, but it's still just not known how these things work. And when we accept that in humans, we see this kind of evidence. It would make sense that an animal that also has a brain might have certain abilities too. So we have to consider alternative possibilities for the things that animals can do.
Yeah, super interesting. So, okay, so let's talk about what kind of impact this has on your worldview. How did that really shift? You were talking about the meaning of life. How does that shift your perspective in living the rest of your life?
In a very big way, because at the minimum, if the consciousness survives the body, then there is some meaning. It's more than what I thought there was. What that meaning is, we can debate it, but that at the minimum, there's something going on. But then you start getting into certain pieces of evidence. And you mentioned the near-death experience. To me, that's one of the most important phenomena that I studied, where people who are in sometimes cardiac arrest, like clinically dead, there's no brain functioning, and they're having these lucid experiences. Many times they're hovering over their body. They're seeing things in the room that are reported as being accurate. And then in many cases, there's like a mystical being that they experience. Sometimes it's a religious figure that's in alignment with their personal religion, and that's how they describe it. Or sometimes it's just like a being of light, as they call it. And it's undeniable because they're experiencing this being. And they describe being with the being and then having a life review where their whole life comes up in a flash. They're experiencing...
Which, by the way, is like my fear. The ladies in my Bible study will joke with me because that's like my fear, is like watching it all play back, and then you have this understanding of reality that you don't have on earth, which is exactly what you described in one of those stories. And I was like, no. I don't want to know all the things I missed out on or did wrong. I don't want to know.
I know, but it just keeps coming up as something that people report. Yeah. And they don't necessarily have a religious background. It's people of all ages. Children report near-death experiences, right. Blind people, as you said. So there's something going on to make me suggest that, to make me think that this is not a hallucination, that it's a real thing. So if we take that as being real, where people are having a life review, they're judging themselves not for how much they obtained materially in their lives, not for what car they bought, but it's how they treated people. And in the cases that I think about this all the time still, that sometimes people then take on the eyes and the body of those they affected. So Bob's having his life review. He was mean to Jane in his life. He replays that event through Jane's eyes sometimes and feels the pain through Jane, which if we're part of the same consciousness, then that actually makes sense. It's like conceivable, but it puts a whole new spin on meaning when the person comes back to their body and they say, well, I don't really care about any of this other job stuff or making money in this way. I just want to help people because that's actually why we're here. So this is really profound stuff, not just for an individual, but I think for all of society. If that's actually what happens, we need to rethink things collectively.
One of the interesting comments that people were experiencing as well, the way you described it was like 360 vision, 360 awareness in these near-death experiences where it was almost like this instantaneous, they understand, they can see, they can perceive things that they were never able to in our physical bodies. And then they come back and they were experiencing this different level of awareness. And then they come back into their bodies. And of course, if they're, experiencing pain, it's kind of a shock to the system. They're like, what just happened?
Yeah.
I want to go back. But that was a really interesting description to me, was that 360 vision and that awareness. I had never heard that when people were talking about.
Yeah. It's like,
the light is kind of a common thing, but yeah.
Right. It's almost that our eyes and our bodies are limiting what we perceive. And then when we're out of the body, it's like we're free. So when you think of blind people who report a near-death experience where they can all of a sudden see in the same way that people report seeing who have normal vision, and then they come back into their bodies and they can't see because they're physically blind, it's suggesting that our awareness is not tied to our body. And that actually when we're out of our body, we are unfettered and we're unrestricted, whereas our body is limiting us. which is a very crazy thing to think about.
It is. And wait, well, okay, so I have to relate this to my belief system again. So it just makes me think about when Christ rose from the grave and appeared to people, he was in his spiritual body. And so he was walking through walls and doing all these things that basically it sounds very similar in terms of description to what we would experience when we are outside of our physical containment. And so it was just a really interesting, when you're talking about this, I'm like, well, we have like a demonstration of that in the Bible about like what that spiritual body looks like, so sort of, and what it can do in terms of rising above matter and going through things. Because there were things in your book about, when you look at something, it behaves physically in a different way than when you're not looking at it. And it's like, there's so many different levels to this. It's just crazy.
I know.
But super, super interesting as well. And I absolutely think there is something beyond this physical body. And like you were saying, it's almost like a limiter in terms of our awareness. But it's what we have right now.
Right.
Being aware of the fact that there is more, I think you're absolutely right. That does affects your whole life. It affects your whole worldview. It affects how you view other people, how you think, how you treat other people. I think that's a big, big shift.
I think it is. And like you were saying earlier, that there's kind of this meshing of what people would traditionally call religion or faith and science. And that's basically exactly what's happening here, is that religious traditions have talked about these things for a long time. And when you view those events with the context of the science that's now coming out, they're both pointing to the same thing. And in certain writings, it's just kind of instances of what science is also showing in instances. So you're reminding me, I actually hadn't thought of that particular case with Jesus's spirit body as you're describing it, but it kind of sounds like what I call the shared death experience in the book, where a person who is healthy is at the bedside of someone who has just died. And that healthy person experiences the near-death experience with the person who's dying. And that person who is healthy has no brain impairment. So it's like almost like dimensions are opening up around the person who's deceased. So you have to wonder if stories like that with someone who has recently died, if that is a form of a shared death experience that's currently being described right now, where the death of a person kind of opens up portals. I'm just theorizing. But people talk about the near-death experience. The shared death experience is a newer one that is coming up all over the place and is really important.
Yeah, that woman talking about seeing her husband's past. I don't know if I want to see that.
No, but she shared the life review with her husband, and she was not dying. Her brain was fine. Her husband had just died.
And that would probably be an instance of where they were so connected. They probably, I don't know how long they were married, but that would be a very interesting thing to know. They're probably like 50 years, 60 years together, something like that. And they're so one that she was able to experience that, which is crazy and sounds totally nuts. And I don't think I'd want that experience, to be honest. Very interesting. But so how do you think, this changes your perspective or our perspective on health and our bodies? We've already kind of talked about, obviously our bodies are a little bit of a limiter, but how do you think that works into our view of health?
Well, glad you mentioned health, because I think it's one of the major implications of this book, which is, there are a few things. Number one is to rethink about the brain and all brain-related issues, including the idea that the brain is not the only organ in the body that is transferring memories potentially or behaviors. So I'll briefly mention a case that's in chapter 2 when I start to just question theoretically the role of the brain. There are organ transplant recipients who take on the memories and personality characteristics of the person they got the organ from.
Yes.
And it's not the brain. And often it's the heart. In some cases, it's the kidney. And in one very striking case, a little girl, we'll just call her Jane, and she got the heart of a girl named Sarah. Sarah was murdered. Jane didn't know that, and Jane's family didn't know that she got the heart of a murdered girl. Jane started having nightmares that she was being murdered. Her mother sent her to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, wait a second, this is like very real. They realized that she got the heart from Sarah, who was murdered, and they started taking down descriptions from Jane's dreams. And they were able to find the murderer, and the police found this person based on this girl's dreams.
That's a documented thing. police reports, hospitalization, I mean, surgery, that's like that happened.
Yeah. And there are other cases of it where sometimes they literally have a different personality. So in terms of health, you're getting the heart from someone else and you're changing your behavior and your memories. What is that? I mean, that has major health implications that we could talk about for a long time. So that's one. Yeah. But I think maybe the biggest one is the idea that the mind is affecting our bodies and physical matter in ways that we don't currently acknowledge with conventional medicine.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I'm getting exposed to more people that do what they call energy work. And a lot of them will talk about how damaging it is to hold on to negative emotions or negative experiences in our life, and how that turns around and literally eats you up on the inside. It's not just this feeling of a knotted stomach. You now have digestive troubles. It's not just this feeling of getting sick. You're actually feeding cancer, or whatever it is that you are personally experiencing. And so the mind-body connection, or I guess emotion, it's sort of you don't want to say brain-body connection necessarily after everything that we just talked about, but how that all impacts your actual well-being, your physical well-being, is just fascinating. And I think more and more people are talking about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. More and more people are, and particularly in the circles that you're in, where you're looking at all solutions for health and not just the conventional ones taught in med school. But I think there's kind of a movement to look at alternative treatments, because so many people are suffering from illnesses and conditions that are not being treated properly, or they're not being treated fully by allopathic medicine, where you take a prescription and it doesn't solve the problem. So I think we need to consider the effect of the mind. And we haven't talked about psychokinesis. I have a whole chapter on that, which is the ability for the mind to literally affect physical matter. And just very briefly, one case where we see a very small effect, but it's been shown over and over again. These were studies run by the former dean of engineering at Princeton. A rocket scientist was looking at machines that are called random number generators.
Oh yeah, the little chicken story. I loved that.
Well, that's a good one. Well, so these machines spit out zeros and ones repeatedly. Mm-hmm. When you have a person put their mental attention to the machine to make it produce more ones than zeros, there's a slight change just by the person's intention. And the chicken story you're mentioning are little robots that were set up that move around in a fixed area based on a random number generator. So it's a random pattern. But then when you put a chick, like a little baby chicken, in a cage next to it that has physically imprinted on it, the machine behaves differently. So it's as if
it wants it to be close.
It wants it to be closer, and you see the behavior of the machine moving toward the chicken, as if the chicken is affecting the behavior of the zeros and ones. So if we take all this together, combined with a bunch of other studies too, it suggests that the mind is affecting physical matter. Our body is physical matter. So what is our mind doing to our body?
Yeah.
We have to question it.
Wow. Well, there is a lot to think about and a lot to sort of digest and process in your book. So your book is called An End to Upside Down Thinking. Thank you, Mark, for talking with us today. I know it's early there, so I appreciate your time. Where can people dialogue with you? Are you on social media? Where can they find your book?
My website is a good place to start, which is just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. And Facebook, Instagram, Twitter are good places to interact. And I'm looking forward to having conversations with more and more people about these topics, because I think it can transform medicine, but it also can transform science and just society more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And I think this is just one piece of the puzzle when we're looking at the body holistically as a whole person. And, like you said, trying to think about different modalities to help people. This is just one key piece to understand. So thanks so much for writing the book and for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.